On April 7th, 2011, in a quiet neighborhood in Tampa, Florida, a shocking discovery was made at the Adams family estate. What began as an unspoken tension between a young wife and her husband's aging grandfather would unravel into a web of blackmail, obsession, and ultimately murder. By the time the police arrived, it was already too late. Blood had been spilled, and the twisted relationship that had been carefully concealed for months was laid bare. The brutal truth behind Rachel Adams's affair would leave the community reeling and spark a scandal that no one saw coming. Rachel Adams, a 23-year-old woman, married young to Michael, hoping for a fresh start in life. She thought their life in suburban Tampa would be perfect, but the cracks in her marriage soon began to show. Michael, only 25, was often preoccupied with his career, leaving Rachel feeling lonely and disconnected. Their love, once full of promise, had turned cold and distant. Richard Adams, Michael's 79-year-old grandfather, was a man who had built his wealth and reputation through cunning and manipulation. After the death of his wife, he became even more controlling, living comfortably off his fortune. To outsiders, he seemed like a wise elder in the family. But beneath that surface, Richard harbored darker desires, ones that would soon pull Rachel into a dangerous and destructive game she never expected. On January 5th, 2011, the tension in the family estate began to shift. Rachel had always felt uneasy around Richard, her husband, Michael's grandfather. There was something about his eyes, the way they seemed to study her every move, that made her feel exposed. That day, Richard cornered her in his study, a room lined with old books and portraits that seemed to stare down at her with silent judgment. Richard, always observant, had learned of Rachel's affair with a younger man from the nearby town, a secret she thought she had buried deep. Richard wasn't angry. Instead, he saw an opportunity. He knew the power he held, and as he stood there in that dark, cold room, he calmly informed Rachel that he was aware of her betrayal. His demands were simple. She was to submit to him or face the destruction of her marriage. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, suffocating her. She imagined Michael's face if he found out, how everything they had built would crumble. Desperate to protect her secret and her life with Michael, she agreed. From that moment, an illicit and degrading relationship began, one in which Rachel felt more like a prisoner than a participant. The days that followed were agonizing for her. By February 12th, 2011, what started as fear had morphed into a twisted routine. Rachel found herself forced to meet with Richard in secret. Each time, she told herself it would be the last. She tried to manage him, playing along just enough to keep him from ruining her life. But Richard was growing bolder. His obsession with Rachel was no longer about control. It was deeper. It was as if he believed that over time, she would want him as much as he desired her. The way he acted towards her began to change. Rachel noticed that he no longer just demanded her compliance. He began to talk about their future, as if they were meant to be together. Richard was convinced that the only thing standing between them was Michael. He started dropping cryptic hints about how different things could be if Michael were out of the picture. His remarks were unsettling, but Rachel tried to dismiss them, convincing herself that he was just trying to scare her into submission. However, it became clear that Richard wasn't simply fantasizing. He was planning. He began to manipulate Michael behind Rachel's back. Subtle comments were made about Rachel's behavior, questioning her loyalty in a way that seemed innocent but planted seeds of doubt in Michael's mind. Richard was a master of suggestion, careful never to accuse her outright. But over time, Rachel could sense the shift in her husband's demeanor. He started watching her more closely, and the once carefree trust they had was slowly replaced by suspicion. Rachel knew that Richard was behind this, pulling the strings like a puppet master. She could feel herself losing control of her life. The weight of his manipulation and the growing cracks in her marriage began to consume her. Every time she saw Michael, she was reminded of how fragile her situation was. Richard would remind her of this too, constantly telling her that Michael didn't deserve her, that their relationship was doomed. He would speak as if he was doing her a favor, as if he was the only one who truly understood her. By March 2nd, 2011, Rachel couldn't take it anymore. She decided it was time to end this. She went to Richard, intending to tell him it was over. But Richard was not someone to let go of what he considered his. As soon as Rachel tried to walk away, Richard's calm exterior shattered. His response was sharp, his threats immediate. If she dared to leave, he would tell Michael everything. He would make sure her life was ruined. But worse than the threats was the way Richard now spoke about his feelings. He no longer saw himself as someone manipulating Rachel. He truly believed he was in love with her. Rachel was horrified. Richard had become consumed by his delusion, and his obsession with her was deeper than she could have ever imagined. He began to tighten his grip on both Rachel and Michael, manipulating every interaction, twisting every conversation to his advantage. It was clear that his ultimate goal was to break up their marriage. But Rachel couldn't tell if it was out of love or simply the need for control. Rachel's life became a nightmare. Every day was spent trying to keep her marriage from falling apart while living under the constant shadow of Richard's control. The fear of exposure, the suffocating presence of a man who now saw himself as her protector, and the guilt of her infidelity all weighed heavily on her. Richard's manipulation had turned her into a shell of the woman she once was. And as the days passed, the pressure continued to mount. The affair, the lies, the twisted love, it all spiraled, threatening to destroy everything in its path. By March 20th, 2011, Richard's manipulation had fully taken hold of Michael. The once easygoing husband had become distant, withdrawn, and suspicious. Rachel could see it in his eyes, the way he watched her, the way he questioned the smallest details about her day. The seeds Richard had planted had begun to grow, and Michael's trust in her was eroding by the day. He didn't confront her directly, but his behavior was enough to make Rachel feel suffocated. Every time they were in the same room, the silence between them grew heavier. Michael was no longer the man she had married, and she knew that Richard was behind it. Richard, feeding off the tension he had created, became more emboldened. He didn't hide his intentions anymore. Whenever they were alone, he would promise Rachel that if she left Michael, they could be together. He painted a picture of a life free from secrecy, where they could live openly, without fear. But Rachel saw the truth. It wasn't love that motivated Richard. It was control. He wanted to possess her entirely, to break down every part of her life until there was nothing left but him. By this time, Rachel had begun to unravel. The psychological strain had taken its toll. Richard's constant presence in her life, his relentless manipulation, and the lies she had to maintain for Michael had pushed her to the edge. She felt trapped. Every option seemed to lead to her destruction. If she stayed with Michael, Richard would ruin her. If she left, she would be under Richard's thumb forever. The walls were closing in, and Rachel no longer knew how to escape. The pressure built over the next 2 weeks. Every day with Richard became more unbearable, his obsession growing more intense. He would taunt her with promises of a future they could share, but it was clear that his real satisfaction came from knowing how much power he held over her. Rachel felt her sanity slipping away. The fear of what Richard would do if she resisted kept her frozen, but the thought of living under his control any longer was unbearable. She was losing herself, piece by piece, and she knew she couldn't continue like this. On April 5th, 2011, everything came to a head. Rachel decided she could no longer tolerate the torment Richard had inflicted upon her. She had spent the morning in a haze, thinking about how trapped she felt, and by the afternoon, she had made up her mind. She had to confront Richard once and for all, and end the nightmare that had consumed her life. That evening, she arrived at the Adams estate. The house was quiet, as always, a place that had once felt grand and comforting, but now only reminded her of her misery. She made her way to Richard's study, where she found him sitting at his desk, calm and composed as ever. He seemed to sense what was coming. Rachel didn't waste any time. She told him it was over, that she couldn't live under his control anymore, and that she was done playing his twisted game. Richard, however, didn't take her seriously. He simply reiterated the threats he had made before, taunting her with how much power he had over her life. He reminded her that if she walked away, he would destroy her marriage, her reputation, and everything she cared about. His words were cruel, but they were calculated. He knew exactly what to say to make her feel powerless. In his mind, there was no escape for Rachel. He would always hold the upper hand. As the argument escalated, something inside Rachel snapped. The months of torment, fear, and manipulation came crashing down on her all at once. Richard was sitting at his desk, smug and self-assured, when she saw the paperweight resting nearby. Without thinking, she grabbed it and, in a fit of blind rage, brought it down on Richard's head. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, and Richard slumped over, the life draining from him instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood frozen, staring at Richard's lifeless body. She hadn't meant to kill him, but now it was done. The man who had tormented her for months was gone, but the reality of what she had done began to settle in. She dropped the paperweight, her hands trembling, and backed away from the desk. The next morning, April 6th, 2011, Michael returned home early from a business trip. He found Rachel sitting alone in their bedroom, staring blankly ahead. She didn't speak when he entered, and when he asked her what was wrong, she didn't respond. Michael, unaware of what had happened, tried to comfort her, but Rachel was in shock, her mind racing through the events of the previous night. She hadn't planned to kill Richard, but now she had to live with the consequences. Later that day, as Michael went about his routine, the phone rang. It wasn't until then that the police were alerted to what had happened at the Adams estate. An anonymous call had been made reporting a disturbance, but no one knew who had called. On April 7, 2011, the police arrived at the estate. When officers entered Richard's study, they were met with the sight of his body slumped over the desk, the blood from his head wound having dried overnight. The initial examination revealed that Richard had died from blunt force trauma, and the crime scene showed signs of a struggle. It didn't take long for investigators to piece together that this had been no accident. On April 8, 2011, the investigation into Richard's death gained momentum. Rachel was brought in for questioning at the local police station. The detectives approached her carefully, aware that the case had many layers yet to be uncovered. Rachel, still in shock and desperate to avoid implicating herself, denied any involvement in Richard's death. Her responses were guarded, and she claimed ignorance about the events of the night before. She portrayed herself as a grieving family member, struggling to cope with the sudden loss of her husband's grandfather. However, as the days passed, investigators began to piece together more about the Adams family dynamics. The relationship between Rachel and Richard didn't sit right with them, and soon suspicions started to surface. They interviewed neighbors, family friends, and anyone who might have noticed anything unusual about the two. It didn't take long before small but significant details began to emerge. Neighbors mentioned how Rachel and Richard's interactions had seemed strained in the weeks leading up to his death. A few even recalled overhearing tense conversations between them, though no one had thought much of it at the time. By April 12, 2011, the police had enough to move forward. Rachel's denials no longer seemed plausible. The inconsistencies in her story stood out, and it became clear that she wasn't telling the full truth. Investigators began to suspect that something much darker had been happening behind the closed doors of the Adams estate. Their suspicions were solidified when they dug into the family's past and uncovered the strange closeness between Richard and Rachel. On April 14, 2011, detectives obtained a search warrant for the Adams family estate. They were granted access to Rachel's personal devices, including her phone and computer. What they found only deepened their belief that Rachel had been involved in Richard's death. The review of text messages and emails between her and Richard painted a chilling picture of manipulation and control. Richard had been blackmailing Rachel for months, forcing her into an affair she desperately wanted to escape. But what shocked investigators most was the intensity of Richard's obsession. His messages showed not only control, but a dangerous fixation on Rachel, hinting at his plans to drive her and Michael apart for good. The more they uncovered, the clearer the situation became. Rachel had been trapped, living under Richard's thumb, unable to break free. Yet the messages also revealed the mounting tension between the two in the weeks leading up to his death. There was no doubt in the minds of the investigators that Rachel had been driven to the edge by Richard's relentless torment. But it was also clear that the confrontation between them had ended violently. By April 20th, 2011, the police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Rachel. Forensic analysis confirmed her involvement. Bloodstains found on her clothing matched Richard's, and her fingerprints were discovered on the paperweight, the weapon used to kill him. It was undeniable now that Rachel had been in the study during the time of Richard's death. She was arrested on suspicion of murder, and the case began to take on a new life in the public eye. As news of her arrest spread, the media quickly latched onto the scandal, portraying it as a tragic story of love, manipulation, and murder. Speculation about Rachel's motives ran wild, with some seeing her as a cold-blooded killer and others viewing her as a victim of Richard's control. But the truth would only come out in the courtroom. On May 5, 2011, Rachel's trial began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution framed Rachel's actions as premeditated. They argued that she had killed Richard in an attempt to escape his blackmail and control. They presented a clear timeline of events, detailing the months of manipulation that had led to Richard's death. The emails and text messages were used to show that Rachel had been planning to break free from Richard, and that the confrontation had been the result of her frustration boiling over. The defense, however, took a different approach. They didn't deny that Rachel had killed Richard, but they framed it as an act of self-defense. They painted her as a victim, manipulated and abused by Richard for months, trapped in a situation from which she could see no escape. The defense argued that on the night of his death, Richard had pushed Rachel too far. They contended that Rachel's actions had been the result of months of psychological abuse, and that in the heat of the moment, she had reacted out of fear and desperation. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, with both sides presenting their cases in great detail. As the days went on, the public became more divided. Some believed that Rachel was entirely justified in her actions, while others saw her as guilty of a crime of passion. By May 20th, 2011, the jury had reached a verdict. After several days of deliberation, Rachel was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The jury had been swayed by the defense's argument that Rachel had acted under extreme emotional distress, and the prosecution's claims of premeditation had been less convincing. While Rachel was found guilty, her sentence was reduced due to the mitigating factors of Richard's manipulation and abuse. Michael, devastated by the truth of his wife's affair and the death of his grandfather, divorces Rachel after the trial. With no children, the couple has little to hold them together, and Michael remarries within 2 years. Rachel, however, serves her sentence in prison, forever marked by the consequences of her affair with Richard. We have so many more cases of insane family affairs that might leave a bad taste in your mouth, like the case where a housewife's secret affair with her father-in-law ends deadly. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates. Don't forget to check out the next video